All right, good morning. So, I recently did a video where I just read this article by Tom Nixon, which was called, I believe, Millionaires and the Surprising Truth About Money, or something very close to that. And in that article, so that article was my first introduction to money work, so called. In that article, Tom Nixon talked about his teacher in the money work, um, in the whole study of one's relationship to money, Peter Koenig. So I read that article several years ago. It introduced me to Peter. I looked into Peter and asked around if there was anyone else doing work based on Peter's career and studies, and I discovered Tim Malnick, who is the interviewee in this Pathless Path podcast episode with Paul Millard. So I then ended up doing a workshop with Tim. I think it was 3 days, 3-day workshop called the Money Game, which was very fun. So I do know Tim. I have had, not in person, but I've done the workshop with him. I've done a few coaching sessions with him. He really was my first real life introduction to the money work, if you will. So it's been several years since then, and I've been diving deeper and deeper into all that work in the time since, and at this point I'm wanting to revisit some of those early ideas and early people and early articles and whatnot that introduced me to all this, so I can refresh my own understanding and help cement it into my own mind, but also to begin sharing this more and more. Obviously, this is not a high this video is not designed to be content exactly, nothing shareable, but it's one step towards sharing these ideas with other people. So yeah, I listened to this interview with Paul Millard and Tim a few times last week. I transcribed it. I've gone through and highlighted my notes and done some progressive summarization on there. So I'm just going to go through and kind of just read my highlights and riff off of them. I might just use the highlights as a stepping stone to talk about anything that it reminds me of, so I might just do free association in that way. I might try to re-articulate some of the points that are made by Tim or Paul in my own words, just for the sake of learning. I'm not really sure how to go, but yeah, so I think I'll just focus on the yellow stuff. So I'm not going to do any justice to Tim's bio, but some brief details about him are: he trained in organizational psychology. He has a background in studying Buddhism. He does one-on-one and group leadership coaching and development work. He is from or lives in Bristol in the UK. And yeah, he has, I don't know how regular he does it, but he runs these money workshops where he takes people through the money game, which is a really fun, interactive way to begin exploring your money and all the different things that come up around money when you start to think about how you relate to it and what it feels like to give it away or to consider spending it, or what do you want to use it for, or the prospect of losing it. What does it mean to you? I won't go into detail about what he does in the money game, but I mean, I've done way more than just the workshop at this point, but even just doing the workshop will give you like a profound amount of new information and insight about your own relationship to money that you could work on for a while and make so much of. So yeah, Tim said, yeah, he also spent time, like he has an activist background. In his 20s, he was doing environmental activism to some extent. And so then there's this highlight, quote, "I was never interested in using my skills to just advance business as usual, just because for me it never made any sense." So he was saying there that, you know, he had this background in activism and you know, working voluntarily for green organizations, etc. And that, you know, then he later went on and studied organizational psychology, so did some work in businesses more proper. And yeah, he's just making that point that given the background that he had, given the values and the point of view on the world that he had, when he did begin to work in businesses, his purpose there was never to just help the business do more of the same, just to advance business as usual. And I don't know if this was a reason why I gravitated to Tim's work way back, but I relate to that so much. I myself, my professional background is in marketing and copywriting, and so after I left college, I read, you know, an obscene amount of business and marketing and copywriting books, and by far my favorite, the most resonant business book that I've arguably, even to this day, the most resonant business book I've ever read was Let My People Go Surfing by Yvon Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia. And that book is like the story of his founding Patagonia and his approach to business and just his general philosophy, and somewhat of a biography. And probably most people know Patagonia. It's an extremely environmentally forward business. Yvon, in the very beginning of the book, says that he never wanted to be a businessman. Like, he wanted to be like an outdoorsman, adventurer. You know, like throughout his career, he would take 3 to 6 months off to go mountaineering or fishing. And as I think about it, and there was another point that he made very early in the book about how he kind of hated might be a strong word, but like really did not admire or respect most business people. And so it was a very bizarre and conflicting position for him to be in as a entrepreneur and as a businessman, and to be in that world. So I always really related to that, of like being in the business world, but my values being very, very countercultural, which is something the next highlight Tim mentions too, having a countercultural mindset. I grew up pretty heavily biased against business, against corporate world, against finance and the stock market and capitalism in general. I grew up in a very environmentally conscious household and larger culture around me, and so as a college graduate working in business, as a marketer and copywriter no less, so effectively a salesman, being the one who's going out and asking and trying to convince money to change hands, and then doing that within the world of finance. It was very confusing because I felt like I was doing what I had grown up to believe was a very bad thing. And so that's been like a kind of a lifelong or adulthood long conflict, is how to be in the business world and still bring those values into it and not just take on the values of the business culture and the business people that I work with, and just be this marketer who's just here to advance business as usual. I've never wanted to do that. Honestly, I've tried to convince myself many times to become comfortable with that, but largely unsuccessful. Anyway, all that said, I really relate to Tim in this respect. Being involved in business, but having these very countercultural, environmentally oriented values. Okay, so fairly typical professional middle class, born in London. His dad was in the investment sector, which is interesting. So he does have some finance in his background, at least through his dad. Interesting point here that Tim says he had the story growing up that his dad didn't much enjoy his work, and he absorbed the message from his dad from a young age that being a professional and succeeding doesn't necessarily guarantee happiness. Which is quite a lesson to learn as a kid. I'm trying to think if that brings any ideas to the surface. I don't know, just what's interesting about that, and what was interesting about him making that point within the context of the interview, was that Paul had asked whether Tim had any mentors or people kind of like who taught him his worldview, the countercultural worldview. And Tim's response was like, not really. My dad actually was in finance, and I grew up in this, professional middle class family in London. So the countercultural stuff, at least as far as I understand, and certainly based on this interview, isn't coming from his family. It's kind of something that he had in him for whatever reason growing up, and then discovered even more so later on in his 20s and in college. Okay. So I'm skipping a lot of background, I realize, but so the next highlight, I had 2 or 3 really wonderful years not worrying at all about career. So there was this period of time after college where Tim kind of got together with this. It almost reminds me of like Teapot in a way, in the sense that there's like just this big group of countercultural people doing all sorts of things, musicians, activists, etc., creative people, artists. He found himself in this culture and got really involved, and was traveling around performing in various ways and doing activism. And he really emphasized that it wasn't really about any of the individual people in particular, that it was really a culture. It was a community of people, and so during that time he just really wasn't worried about his career. But then he goes on to say, I do have another side. I have a side that's kind of ambitious. And I realized that I was a little bit against it, or a little bit judging that side. So he was living this life within this community, not really caring about money or his career or ambition, and then got to a point where he realized, oh, I do have this ambitious side of me. I do have this ambition in me, and I've been judging that. I've been, he doesn't say suppress, but, not looking at it favorably, pushing it to the side, if you will, not giving it any real attention or allowing it to exist. So continuing on, he says, in his mind, the ambitious people go off and run businesses, and all the cool hippies who are interesting, they just hang out. That was his description of his mindset at that time. And so in my mid-20s, I went through actually a very painful year where I realized I didn't belong in either of those groups. I realized I wanted to kind of get on and somehow contribute and create in a particular way, but I didn't want to do it in a way that felt like I was sucked into the machine. So, yeah, that's at a high level, right? He's just saying he realized after spending all this time not being ambitious, really just living a more creative life, community-focused life, he realized that he actually also wanted to do more, that there was this ambition in him that he had been neglecting and judging, and he had these ideas about what it meant to be ambitious. He made that contrast of like the cool hippies who are interesting, they just hang out, and that's what he had been doing, and he didn't want to be one of those ambitious people that go off and run businesses and get sucked into the machine. But then he realized that he did have ambition, and he wanted to create, and he wanted to make more of an impact and contribute. So then the question was, okay, what does that mean for like what group I'm a part of, right? He said, I felt like I didn't belong to either of those groups. Not fully one of these hippies who just hangs out, not fully one of these ambitious people that just wants to go start a business. And I very much relate to that as well. I've always felt, like I have 1 foot in the business world, 1 foot in, the marketing world, and 1 foot completely out of it, at least internally, in terms of like where my values are and what I want to be doing with my life. 1 foot in, 1 foot out. Split down the middle. Ambitious side of me wants to do very well, wants to succeed in business. But then there's a side that doesn't want anything to do with that in many ways. So, as a result of that period of time, Tim says, I made the first conscious career decision. I was probably about 27, and I thought, I'll train in organizational psychology, because that can allow me to work in mainstream situations, but hold a perspective that's maybe quite spiritual or quite countercultural. So that's really interesting. I don't really know much about organizational psychology. I've met a few people who do that, but haven't gotten to know them well enough to understand what they do in their work. But it does seem like a position where you're potentially or theoretically, you can kind of be like a therapist within a business. So you're part of the team, or you're a consultant to the team, and you function in many ways as a therapist. I know there's probably other factors. They talk later, Tim and Paul talk later about, like doing psychometric reports and stuff like that. So you're doing kind of higher level evaluations of the whole team, I guess, but yeah, it seems an interesting role that you can have kind of one foot in psychology and like how do you make a group cohere better, how do you make a group work together better, get along better, organize itself in more functional, effective ways, and work with the individuals as well within that to help that process. And bringing ideas from psychology into that, which might not otherwise be entertained by business people. So that's very interesting. I didn't highlight it, but Paul says you're almost like an internal corporate anthropologist. And then I forget whether it was Tim or Paul that said this, but that it can easily get co-opted. This role can easily get co-opted. Pretty sure this was Paul. Business leaders' conceptions of how to work with organizational psychologists is incredibly limited. So, again, I don't know really how this plays out in the real world of what it looks like to be an organizational psychologist, but I can see how it could get completely subjugated to the overriding business culture and philosophy, and then you can't really do much interesting stuff. All right. So back to Tim. It's always been clear for myself that the only interesting and worthwhile things, this is probably just like a mistake in the transcript. It's always been clear for myself that the only interesting and worthwhile things is to use those psychology skills, development skills, in service of questioning the purpose of what does this business exist to do? How does it relate to the wider world, including past and future, and the people in it? And, first and foremost, what is their purpose and what's their life journey? That to me is like such a powerful little phrase there, a little idea that I feel like I've written things to that effect many times on Twitter. One very ranty thread that I made several years ago was about is it possible to be a good and effective marketer when you don't really care about the business goals and you only care about the customers as people? And that, that's coming from what feels like a very similar thing as Tim was just describing, that the main thing for me and for him is okay, I'm in business and I have these points of views, these skills, this knowledge, psychology and developmental knowledge. How am I using that stuff? And for him, the only really interesting way of using that stuff is to question the purpose of what the business is there for in the first place. Not just taking that for granted and trying to further that without questioning it. So why does this business exist? What is it here to do? Why? What impact is it trying to make? How is it functioning? How does it relate to the wider world, right? And then, the people within it, what is their purpose and what's their life journey? So not seeing the people within a business as simply human capital, who are there to just be pawns to achieve business goals, just assets to be used effectively by the business leaders, but really looking at the employees as humans. What is their purpose? What's their life journey? Why are they there? And for me, that's always been a huge thing. That's like tends to be the main kinds of questions that I want to ask people, and don't always feel the freedom to do within the workplaces. I want to know, like, why are you here? Why do you have this job? What attracted you to this job, and what keeps you here, and what's your, what's the vision, and, do you like it? Like, if you do like it, that's amazing. Like, what is it that you're so passionate about here? What do you find interesting in this work? Those are the kinds of questions that I want to know. I want to get to know people as the individuals and human beings that they are, and how they relate to the job, but I'm much less interested in just talking about the job. To me, to be honest, that's quite boring. So in that respect, I very much relate to Tim, and those questions, both the ones that I expressed wanting to ask most of the time, and what Tim has said, they can be very subversive within the business context, right? Because some of those questions are very personal questions, and people don't always actually love the job. They might not be there for like reasons that they want to share, in as much as like they might not really like the job, they might not really care about the company, and they're just there to get by or whatever, like provide for their family. And they're like, that's risky to share, to say that like, oh yeah, I don't actually care about this that much. I've felt that many times, right? People asking me about my interest in the business, and feeling quite anxious to share in any depth, because I feel like, oh, if I talk about this, I'm going to end up saying that, or conveying that actually I don't want to be here that much. And doing that could lead to people asking, why are you even here then? And that could lead to losing the job. So, well, there's a whole nother rabbit hole there around why that's such a scary thing, but I won't dig into that now. Yeah. One further thought on that is, I mentioned those questions seeming and coming across at times as quite subversive. It has felt like a pattern in my life that in basically every business that I join as an employee, I feel like I end up immediately, like, as I try to learn what the business is about and what we do and what products we're selling and who we're selling it to, etc., my tendency is to like question the foundational premises of the business. Like, what is the core belief about the world, and about what's good for people that this business is based on? And oftentimes when I start to do that, and I do that because like I want to believe in what I'm doing, it's very hard for me to, especially as a marketer who's out there promoting the business and using my own words to promote the business and share the ideas of the business. Like, it's very hard for me, at least, to do that if I don't really believe in it. And so my MO is always, when I join a business, to try to understand what is the idea here, like what are the assumptions being made, and usually I find that when I start doing that, I start to sort of it tends to lead me away from fully believing in the company. I start to think like, oh, actually, well, I don't agree with these assumptions, I think actually maybe there's a better way, or like this is a really ineffective way, or like whatever it is. So that has felt like a pattern in my career, that I joined businesses, and in the process of trying to understand those businesses so that I can like genuinely, authentically, and wholeheartedly promote them and do the work every day, I end up questioning the very foundations of those businesses, and then I find myself like not really able to believe in and promote these businesses wholeheartedly, because I've come to see things differently. So yeah, that is a thing that I have experienced. So then Paul says, oh yeah, this is an interesting part. So Paul says, this is why I'm actually a pretty big fan of working in organizations, larger organizations, institutions, or corporations. I think people think I want everyone to just like blow up their life and go travel to Bali. But I think learning how the world actually works saves you from getting trapped. And I think a lot of activists and artists struggle with this starving artist script that we can't sell out. I think those are not very helpful beliefs, because there's far more potential and possibility by learning how to transcend those different worlds, speak to different languages, and figure out how the world actually works, rather than just being angry that it's not how you want it to be. Yeah, that really hits home. I feel like that's an idea that I kind of took to heart in many ways when I started my career, because I was definitely in the latter group of people who I grew up not wanting to sell out, like I said in the beginning, very much biased against capitalism in general and business world, like business values, business culture, finance, etc. So for me, joining the business world, let alone what I ended up doing within it, very much felt like selling out. But I was very aware of that, and I was aware that I had all these biases, and I didn't want to just throw up my hands and kind of run in the opposite direction. I didn't want to say like, oh, business is like, I've grown up believing business is bad, my values are otherwise, I'm gonna just say it's bad and not even involve myself, and kind of just remain an outsider to it, remain kind of naive to how it actually works on the inside, like not know anyone who actually lives and works within it, right? So just like assuming all these things about the people who work in the business world and who work in corporations. I didn't want to do that. And so I kind of reined myself in and put myself into the business world so that I could try to do what Paul describes here. Try to understand how the world actually works, so to speak. And that's like a very interesting thing over the past few years since I did the money workshop with Tim. One of the big beliefs that I had going into that money workshop was this idea that the business world, the finance world, those people and that culture knew how the world actually works, and that I, coming from the outside of it, coming from a sort of countercultural perspective, didn't actually know how the world works. And so that's been a very interesting belief to parse out over the past few years, because it shows up in so many different little ways throughout my life. But yeah, I very much had this idea that, like, while I see the world very differently than business people and whatnot, I had this deeper feeling that they understood how the world worked more than I did, more than the people that I grew up around. And so I've also felt this really intense compulsion to put myself in the business world so that I could understand how the real world works, so to speak, right? Because I believed that those were the people that did understand how the real world works. That's been a whole thing, you know. I don't know whether Paul would agree with me or not, but he didn't say one way or the other. But that this idea that the business world is the culture and is the people who understand how the real world works, that's something that I've untangled a lot over the years, and I no longer take it to be quite the fundamental truth that I once thought it was, which has been very valuable for me. And not to say that I don't still have that. It still lives in me to some extent, but it's a lot less than it was. And it's much more equal. They understand the world in a particular way. I understand the world in a particular way. The people on the other side of the spectrum, entirely activists, etc., they understand the world in a very particular way, but it's all equal. No one is more intelligent or more correct than the others. It's just people starting in very, very different points of views with extremely different experiences and value systems, etc. I think I'm going to wrap this up, but I want to read a couple more highlights. So then Tim kind of responds saying, to transcend, to encounter and be in a system, like a work system or an economic system, and engage with it so you can transcend it, it's a wonderful, magical thing, and it's challenging. It's very challenging. And then he goes on to say, there's a lot of unconscious shadow in people who identify as wanting to change the world. It's very easy to do. You stand in a position, you critique the mainstream, but then you're always in this kind of unconscious opposition. And then you're actually avoiding whole parts of your own human nature, which you're probably going to need to make change happen. So I'll leave it at that, but that highlight kind of speaks to what I was saying about myself a minute ago, is that I was this sort of activist, environmentalist. I mean, before going to college, like in high school, I was super interested in educational philosophy, and I was extremely skeptical and critical of this like mainstream education system of just like conveyor belt education, prep school education, where it's just like, why are we learning? Oh, it's just so that you can get a good grade, so that you can get into the AP courses, so that you can get into a good college, so that you can get into a good job and be, quote, successful, right? And I was always like, well, what the fuck is that? Like, So it's not learning for the sake of learning, it's just learning for the sake of being on this conveyor belt to get to this vague idea of success. And even in high school, when I was like 14, 15 years old, that was like very top of mind. And, you know, there was a book I wrote my entrance essay to college about this. It was called Earth in Mind by this professor of ecology named David Orr. And he has a whole section in that about what is the purpose of education and how this like conveyor belt style of education doesn't really consider like what the fuck it's for. What, you know, people don't. I remember I also had this experience in high school where there was some big, you know, the dean spoke to like everyone in the high school at some point, and he was talking about success, and he was just quoting all these famous people. What's their definition of success? And I remember leaving that speech just so frustrated. I was like, he's just telling us that like success is the most important thing, but he doesn't even have his own definition of it. He's just quoting all these other people. And I just thought it was very ridiculous. So it's like this thing that we're all taught to pursue, this idea of success, it's very vague. And we're not really taught to like define what that is for ourselves. So then we just go on this path, you know, and without really thinking about it, without thinking about where it's taking us or why it's important or what we actually want to do. So anyway, all of that to say, I was very much going into college, one of these people, that artist, activist types of people, who was very much in a position of critiquing mainstream culture. And that was entirely what Tim says is entirely how things was for me. That I had this like intense amount of shadow around that stuff. Because like Tim said before, you know, there is also that ambitious side of him. I also have a very ambitious side of me, but I was skeptical of it. You know, I thought it was bad for all sorts of reasons, some of which I've talked about here, but I thought that ambitious part of me was bad. I thought that part of me that wanted to be successful and make a lot of money, etc., that was bad, and I didn't really have any compassion for it, you know, and I just critiqued the hell out of anybody who represented that way of life and that approach to the world. And yeah, like I said, coming out of college, I was very aware that that was the case, and I didn't want to just stay in that. I wanted to face that stuff. I wanted to let my ambitious side see the light of day. But yes, I mean, so I put myself in a position to engage with and understand the business culture and mainstream culture, but the other side of me, the activist part, didn't go away, and so that's been like the entire struggle of adulthood, is like having those two parts of me in conflict, the ambitious side and the activist side, or the artist side, if you will. Like, how do these go together? How do these reconcile? How do these become integrated with each other even, right? So that they're not just two completely separate parts of myself, but that they can work together in some way. And that's like a very high level, simplified description of the experience that I've had with money for a long time now, which led me to be very interested in Tim's work, in Peter Koenig's work, in Tom Nixon's work. So I'm going to stop here, and I will pick back up with this at some other point.